This is another lesson in the New Testament is Fake series on the Yalak Ahmed channel, Twitter, YouTube, Patreon. It is August 25th, 2021. This lesson is titled Fountain of Blood. Zechariah chapter 13, verse 1, it reads, "In that day there shall be a fountain opened to the house of David, and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and for uncleanness." We were taught that Jesus, his death on Calvary, was what was done by God the Father to save sinners, save the world, or to save the tribes of Israel. And I remember partly a song from childhood in Jamaica. I don't remember the words properly, but something like, "There is a fountain filled with blood, drawn from Emmanuel's vein." But it's funny that when you read Zechariah 13 here, it's not actually talking about a fountain of blood. They just taught us that there is a fountain of blood and you should be washed in the blood. It's just a great deception. This whole Jesus thing is just 100% deception. 100. In that day, so this is future. Usually when I read Zechariah 13, I'm reading Zechariah 12, 13, and 14 together. And those three chapters are talking about the future when Israel will be delivered, Jerusalem will be restored, and so on. So again, it's end times talk that's going on in these chapters. So he's saying in that day, that is to come, he means, there shall be a fountain open. So this fountain of blood dripping or draining from Jesus on the cross of Calvary is not what the Most High is talking about here. Because that happened 2,000 years ago, they said. But this is saying, still in that day, a fountain will be opened. But this is saying, still in that day, a fountain will be opened. So it is not talking about a Roman story from supposedly 2,000 years ago. This has nothing to do with Jesus, Calvary, or blood. Or blood. When we read the Torah, you can get enough understanding of the washing for cleansing and purifying. Even when a priest would be washing his garments and washing himself to prepare for a sacrifice on a holy day, he would not be washing himself in blood and also washing his garment in blood in order to wear that out in front of the people and going into the temple, dripping with the blood all over the Holy of Holies, trying to enter that place. We have been deceived. The fountain opened would more give an idea of a fountain of water. So what the verse is starting out meaning is, in that day there shall be salvation opened up to the house of David, with the understanding of a fountain of water that will be opened up, gushing and washing away the sins of the house of David and also for the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and for uncleanness. If Jesus died to save sinners or to save the children of Israel, then there would be no need for the Most High to set apart a day in the future when salvation will be opened up like a fountain of cleansing water to clean the house of David, purify them, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, because Jesus would have done it. on Calvary, according to the Roman story. But he also would not need to have this cleansing for the house of David and Jerusalem for sin and for uncleanness, because Jesus' death and washing with his blood on Calvary would have washed away the sin and the uncleanness. What the writer is here telling you is that in the future, when the Most High delivers Israel and reestablishes the kingdom, you will still have sin because your sin was not removed by Jesus on Calvary, and you will still be unclean before the Most High. That is why a cleansing will be needed at the end. Even though Jesus shed his blood for sin, they teach us, 2,000 years ago. The New Testament is fake. And finally, it is not just the cleansing that he's doing and so on that is important. What one has to understand here when they read this Zechariah 13 verse 1 is that God is doing something to address the sin and the uncleanness of his people. He's doing something. He is doing something in that day in the future, because he did not do anything in the past 2,000 years ago. So the writer is telling of something that God will do in order to clear up the sin of the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. He's saying God is going to do something about that sin because, you've served your punishment in your captivities and so on. So now God will do something. He will remove your sin when he is reestablishing the kingdom. Because he never did anything about the sin to clear it up 2,000 years ago on Calvary. He never did it at any time since you went into your captivity. So it's in the future that he's going to be doing it. So the writer is not only saying sin will be removed, but he's saying God is going to address the sin, clear up the sin later on. So God did not send Jesus to clear up the sin at Calvary 2,000 years ago, or he would not be saying in the future, in that day, it will be done. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 14, it reads, I know that whatsoever God doeth, it shall be forever. Nothing can be put to it, nor anything taken from it. And God doeth it, that men should fear before him. So if God already did the cleansing for people at Calvary 2,000 years ago, why is something else going to be added to that when it says here, nothing can be put to it? And he's adding to Calvary. Why? Would that be because the sin wasn't really removed by Jesus' sacrifice? But this says nothing can be put to it. So then he would not be adding another day in the future to add to the day at Calvary with the sacrifice of his so-called son. The New Testament is fake. But it goes on to say, nor anything taken from it. And the way people talk about Calvary so much, Calvary, 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 Jesus shed his blood, and he died to bring two sticks back together and so on. Calvary, 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 Calvary. The way people talked about Calvary so much, that would certainly be taking away from the future talk about in that day I will address the sin. That's taking away from it. So much so that you do not just walk around and hear people talking about in that day. You don't hear Israelites saying in that day or Christians saying in that day. They more talk about that day gone by 2,000 years ago. They focus on that day so much that it takes away from the promise of in that day there will be a fountain opened up for the house of David and for the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Calvary takes away from, But the scripture says nothing can be put to it, nor anything taken from it. If God already did a work through Jesus at Calvary, there would be no in that day promise. And to set up an in that day promise, he cannot do anything that will take away from it, which would be something like Calvary. The New Testament is fake. So I'll read it one more time and close this. Zechariah 13 verse 1. In that day there shall be a fountain opened to the house of David and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and for uncleanness. Twitter, YouTube, Patreon, Yalak Emet channel. The New Testament is fake. There is no salvation in Jesus or at Calvary. The salvation will come in the future. It speaks of it here as being something that will happen in that day. The end.